Hello, my name is Jennifer Varnum. Today we are going to be talking about how grief is portrayed in world literature. We're going to look at 4 popular stories that we have read for this class. First of all, I'm going to tell you grief is present in a lot of stories, and grief can be thought of in many different ways, but for the purpose of this presentation, grief is going to be defined as experiencing sadness, emptiness, or hopelessness as a result of losing a person that is important to someone. And today I am going to be proving how grief is a powerful emotion that causes people to change their entire lives. The similarities between these stories is that these are stories of grief due to the loss of lovers. The first story we're going to look at is Orpheus and Eurydice from the Metamorphoses by Ovid. In that story, Eurydice was killed after her wedding to Orpheus, and she died immediately from a snake bite. And then Orpheus spends the rest of his days trying to get her back, and then when he doesn't succeed, he is overcome by grief by her death. The second story that we are going to look at is Venus and Adonis. And what happens in Venus and Adonis is when Adonis does not listen to Venus's warnings, and he is killed by a boar, and she is overcome with grief. The third story we are going to look at is from the Decameron, the 4th day, 5th story of Elisabetta. When Elisabetta is looking for Lorenzo, she just becomes sad, and then she discovers that he is actually dead. And then she goes and digs up his head and puts it in a pot of basil, and then sits and cries and cries and cries over it, and is overcome and consumed in her grief. And then finally, the 4th story we are going to look at is the tale of the Enchanted King. The Enchanted King is not the person who is grieving in this story. The grieving is done by his wife, the witch or the maiden. We know that the king stabs her boyfriend in the throat, and he becomes mute, and he essentially is neither alive nor dead. And then the maiden or the wife grieves over him, and she is constantly by his side and consumed in trying to bring him back to her. So, how does grief change our characters? In Orpheus and Eurydice, we have a man, Orpheus. He is grief-stricken over the loss of his wife, Eurydice. He tries to bring her back. He looks back at her, and she falls right back down to Hades because he wasn't supposed to look at her. He displays self-destructive behavior as a result of the loss because he goes into isolation. He's surrounded by trees and nature. He doesn't want to have anything to do with any women. He rejects them. And then he turns his affections towards men. The quotes are, Orpheus had fled completely from the love of women, and he transferred the affections to youthful males. He has changed his life. He no longer wants to be at home. He wants to be by himself. He doesn't want to love anybody. He wants to be with men to satisfy his needs, but he doesn't really want to be in love with them or have a relationship with them. So that's how he changes his life. Secondly, in Venus and Adonis, we have Venus who is grief stricken because Adonis is now dead. She vows she wants to lament. She wants to stay in that place year after year and redo that time in her life, which is a very sad period. And she does this by transforming him into a flower, and she wants to mourn over him forever. So grief changes her because she forever wants to stay in that place. She doesn't care anymore about being a god or doing her godly duties. And the quote from the text is, "My grief for Adonis will be remembered forever, and every year will see reenacted in ritual form his death and my lamentation." The fourth story is from the Decameron, the fourth day, fifth story. Elisabetta has discovered that Lorenzo is dead. So she essentially just stays with a pot and cries and cries. And she changes her life because she no longer wants to do anything else. It's the only thing she wants to do is sit and cry. And she makes herself physically sick. After her brothers take away the pot, and she ends up dying because that's how the grief changed her. It consumed her. And the quote from the story is, "She took to sitting continually by the spot and regarding it lovingly, concentrating all her desire upon it." And the fourth story, the tale of the Enchanted King. And what we have here is a wife who has been unfaithful to her husband. The husband wants to get back at her, so he takes it upon himself to go kill both of them, but he only succeeds in wounding the lover. And grief changes the wife because she's just isolated. She wants to be in the mausoleum. She doesn't care about the rest of her life. She doesn't want to be at home. She doesn't want to be with her husband. She just wants to be by her lover's side. And it makes her angry and vengeful, and she wants to harm others. And that's how it changed her life. The quote from the text is, "God has delivered into my hand the one who did this to me and set my heart ablaze with the fire of revenge." The results of their grief are, in Orpheus and Eurydice, we have Orpheus. He lost himself in his grief. He refuses to take on another relationship. He's isolated from the possibility of loving a woman. Venus and Adonis. Venus is unable to continue her duties as a god. She is consumed by her grief, and much like Orpheus, she changes her entire life because of her grieving. And the fourth day, fifth story, Elisabetta cries herself to death. She is completely consumed in grief like Orpheus and Venus. However, she had made herself gravely ill. In the tale of the Enchanted King, unlike Orpheus, Venus, and Elisabetta, the maiden harms other people in her grief instead of doing self-harm and isolation. Her villainous actions caused by her grief ultimately caused her to be killed by the king. The differences in these stories are that Elisabetta, Venus, and Orpheus grieve because their lovers are dead, while the wife grieves over a lover who is wounded yet still alive, and she still has some hope for him. Venus and the wife are both supernatural beings, and they transform people in their grief, while Elisabetta and Orpheus weren't able to transform anyone. The wife is the villain, and she uses her magic to harm others. Venus, Elisabetta, and Orpheus do not use their grief to intentionally cause harm to others. Orpheus tried to bring back his wife and failed, but none of the others had such an opportunity. The outlier is the wife. So unlike the other characters, she is not a character that the audience is supposed to sympathize with. We are supposed to dislike her. The other characters are victims of loss. However, the wife created her circumstances by cheating on her husband. The story wants us to sympathize with the husband who the wife has turned into half stone, and she beats him. The Outlier wants to teach us that adultery leads to death and that killing a cheating spouse is justified. It also teaches that grief is no excuse for harming others. So in conclusion, the story is a way that people can relate to each other. Many people can relate to grief in some way. It may not be a lover, but most everybody has lost somebody important to them. These 4 stories tell us how people handle grief in both similar and different ways. And most importantly, these stories show how grief changes people.